At the law firm on that dreary Thursday morning, I heard my sister-in-law whisper to her husband, "Did you see what Benjamin inherited? A worthless old toolbox. All those years kissing up to Dad, and this is what he gets." My son heard every word. He was only 16, dressed in his best thrift store suit, holding the rusty red toolbox that had been his grandfather's final gift. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just smiled quietly and held that box closer to his chest. And what he revealed next about that worthless inheritance? Nobody in that mahogany-paneled room saw it coming. Not the lawyers, not the family, and certainly not me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's how everything changed. In a room where wealth was measured in zeros and bank statements, where my brother's children walked away with trust funds and my sisters divided up real estate portfolios worth millions, one old toolbox was about to redefine what true inheritance really means. I'm Sarah Chen, and I've been raising my son Benjamin alone since his father walked out when he was just 4 years old. We've lived paycheck to paycheck, sometimes meal to meal, but we've never lived without love. Benjamin is the kind of kid who fixes broken things, not just objects but hearts too. He's the one who stayed after school to tutor struggling classmates, who saved his allowance to buy groceries for our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who spent summer afternoons teaching children in our apartment complex how to read. My father, Robert Chen, was a carpenter before he became successful in construction. He built houses that lasted generations, bridges that connected communities, and a business empire that employed hundreds. But what made him truly wealthy wasn't the money. It was the relationships he built, the lives he touched, the legacy he created beyond dollar signs. He saw something special in Benjamin from the very beginning. When Benjamin was 8, he found a wounded sparrow in our courtyard. Most kids might have forgotten about it by dinner time, but Benjamin spent 3 days nursing it back to health, building a tiny splint for its wing from popsicle sticks and medical tape. He named the bird Hope and released it only when he was certain it could fly again. My father watched this whole process unfold during his visits, and I saw something shift in his eyes. "That boy understands what really matters," he told me one evening, as we watched Benjamin carefully clean the makeshift bird hospital he'd created. Over the years, whenever Benjamin visited his grandfather, they'd spend hours together in the old workshop behind the main house. While other grandchildren played video games or watched television, Benjamin was learning to sand wood until it was smooth as silk, to measure twice and cut once, to see the potential in discarded materials. His grandfather taught him that every tool had a purpose, every scrap of wood held possibility, and every project was an opportunity to leave something beautiful behind. The will reading was scheduled for 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon at Morrison & Associates, the premier law firm downtown. I had borrowed a car from my co-worker, a 10-year-old sedan with a rattling exhaust pipe, to get us there. We were running late because Benjamin insisted on stopping at a flower shop to buy a single white rose for his grandfather's memory. It cost $12, money I didn't really have to spare. But the quiet pride in his eyes was worth 1,000 times that amount. The law office occupied 3 floors of a glass and steel tower that pierced the Seattle skyline. Inside, everything was polished marble and expensive leather, the kind of place where even whispers echoed with the weight of serious money. My stilted heels clicked awkwardly on the floors, shoes I'd bought at a consignment shop and practiced, walking in for days before the appointment. We arrived to find the conference room already full. My brother Marcus sat at the head of the table with his wife Victoria, both dressed in designer black that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My sister Elena and her husband were there too, along with their twin daughters who kept texting on phones that were newer than my laptop. Everyone looked appropriately somber, but I could see the anticipation in their eyes. They were here for their piece of the pie, and they already knew roughly how big that pie was. The lawyer, Mr. Morrison, was a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes that had obviously seen thousands of these family gatherings over the decades. He welcomed each family member personally, offering condolences and coffee from a silver service that belonged in a museum. When he got to Benjamin and me, his handshake lingered a moment longer, and he smiled at Benjamin with genuine warmth. "Your grandfather spoke of you often, young man," he said, and I watched my son's face light up despite the sad circumstances. As we took our seats around the massive conference table, I noticed the looks. My family, or rather, my late husband's family, since I'd never really been accepted as one of them, had that particular expression they wore whenever they remembered I existed. Polite tolerance mixed with barely concealed irritation. We were the poor relations, the reminder that not everyone in the Chen family tree had flourished equally. Victoria's whisper cut through the preliminary small talk like a blade. "Did you see what Benjamin inherited? A worthless old toolbox. All those years kissing up to Dad, and this is what he gets." She wasn't even trying to be subtle about it. My sister-in-law had never liked me, had never hidden her belief that I'd somehow trapped her brother-in-law into marriage and then failed to keep him around. Benjamin heard every cruel word. He was sitting right next to me, after all, but he didn't react the way I expected. Instead of shrinking into his chair or getting defensive, he simply placed his hands on the weathered toolbox that sat in front of him on the table. It was old, that was true. The red paint was chipped and faded, the metal clasps were tarnished, and it definitely looked out of place among the sealed envelopes containing stock certificates, property deeds, and seven-figure inheritance checks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Shh," Marcus hissed at his wife, but not out of concern for Benjamin's feelings. He was worried about appearances, about the lawyers hearing their family's petty dynamics. "Let's just get through this." Mr. Morrison cleared his throat and opened his leather portfolio. The will reading was formal, methodical, going through each bequest with careful precision. Marcus inherited the construction company, along with the main family home and its surrounding 10 acres. Elena received the summer house in the Hamptons, plus a portfolio of commercial real estate that generated enough monthly income to fund a comfortable retirement. The grandchildren were set up with trust funds that would mature when they turned 21, ensuring they'd never have to worry about college tuition or starting capital for their own ventures. And then there was Benjamin's inheritance. "To my grandson Benjamin Chen, I leave my original toolbox and all its contents, with the hope that he will understand its true value and use it to build a future worthy of the Chen name." That was it. No explanation, no additional zeros, just an old toolbox that had probably cost $30 when it was new. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my face burn with embarrassment, not for Benjamin but for my own naivety. Had I really expected my father-in-law to see past the family politics and recognize Benjamin's worth? Had I been foolish to think that years of afternoons spent learning woodworking and life lessons would translate into something more than a symbolic gesture? But Benjamin's reaction surprised everyone. He stood up suddenly, lifting the toolbox with both hands as if it were made of gold. "Thank you, Grandpa Robert," he said to the room, his voice steady and clear. "I promise I'll take good care of it." Victoria actually laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that bounced off the conference room walls. "At least he won't have to worry about inheritance taxes," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Elena joined in with fake sympathy. "Oh, honey, I'm sure there's sentimental value in it. Maybe there's some old tools you can sell on eBay." Even Marcus, who had always been the most diplomatic of the siblings, couldn't hide his relief that his father hadn't been foolish enough to split the real assets with people who couldn't properly manage them. Dad was always practical. He said with a patronizing pat on Benjamin's shoulder. He knew you'd appreciate something with personal meaning. The twins, now 16 and uninterested in anything that didn't involve social media, actually took a photo of Benjamin with his toolbox. "This is going viral," one of them giggled. "Poor cousin with his inheritance from the past." I wanted to stand up and scream at all of them. I wanted to grab that photo and delete it, to demand they show some respect for the boy who had loved their father more purely than any of them ever had. But Benjamin seemed remarkably calm. He was studying the toolbox like it held the secrets of the universe, his fingers tracing the worn handles, the scratched surface, the faded manufacturer's logo. Mr. Morrison was watching this exchange with increasing discomfort. As a lawyer who specialized in estate planning, he'd seen families tear themselves apart over money countless times, but something about this felt different. "If I may," he interjected. "Carefully, your grandfather was very specific about Benjamin's inheritance. He spent considerable time ensuring the wording was exactly right." "Of course," Marcus said dismissively. "Dad always was sentimental about his old things. Remember that speech he gave at my wedding about his first drill? Benjamin will probably get a similar speech every Christmas about this box." But I was watching Benjamin, and something was happening. His posture had changed, straightened. There was a look in his eyes I'd never seen before, not confusion or hurt, but understanding. Like pieces of a puzzle were suddenly clicking into place. "Grandpa Robert left me a letter," Benjamin said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket. "He gave it to me last month, said I should only read it after today." The room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, expectant, even slightly nervous. Benjamin unfolded a handwritten letter, real paper, ink pen, the kind of letter that takes time and intention to write. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "Benjamin, if you're reading this, then you're at the law office holding my old toolbox and probably feeling pretty disappointed. You're surrounded by family members who are measuring your inheritance in dollars and finding it lacking. They don't understand what I'm really giving you, but I trust that you will." Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Elena stopped. "Texting." Even the twins put their phones down. Benjamin continued. "That toolbox isn't empty, son. It never has been. Look under the bottom panel." Without hesitation, Benjamin flipped the toolbox over. What we'd all assumed was a solid bottom was actually a shallow drawer that had been cleverly concealed. With practiced movements that suggested he'd suspected this secret all along, he slid the drawer open. Inside was a thick folder of documents. But these weren't just any documents. "The first document is a deed," Benjamin announced, his voice growing stronger with each word. "To a 500-acre plot of land outside of Leavenworth, zoned for residential and commercial development." The numbers were staggering. At current market prices, that land was worth at least $10 million. "The second document," Benjamin continued, clearly enjoying the moment now, "is a promissory note. Apparently, Grandpa Robert owned the mortgage on the building where the Morrison law firm is located, and 3 other buildings downtown, and a shopping center in Bellevue." Mr. Morrison's eyes widened. His was professional enough to maintain composure, but I could see the surprise in his face. Even he hadn't known the full extent of what was in that toolbox. "The third document," Benjamin said, pulling out a leather-bound ledger, "is a list of loans Grandpa Robert made to various people over the years. Loans that are still active, still earning interest, and now belong to me." Victoria had gone completely white. Marcus was calculating furiously, probably trying to determine exactly how much his 16-year-old nephew had just inherited. Elena looked like she was about to be sick. "The fourth document," Benjamin continued, his voice now filled with quiet pride, "is a business plan. a detailed outline for a nonprofit organization focused on affordable housing construction using sustainable materials and employing people who need second chances. Grandpa Robert worked on this plan for 3 years, investing in land, securing permits, establishing partnerships with suppliers. He looked up from the papers, meeting each family member's eyes in turn. He didn't leave me money. He left me a mission and all the tools I need to accomplish it. The toolbox, it turned out, was both metaphorical and literal. Hidden in secret compartments were also bearer bonds, cryptocurrency wallets with detailed access codes, and deeds to properties that hadn't been included in the main will, because they were held in a trust that would activate only when Benjamin found them. But perhaps most importantly, there was a note addressed to the entire family, to be read aloud only after Benjamin had revealed the true contents of his inheritance. "To my loving family," Benjamin read, his grandfather's final words filling the silent room. "I gave each of you what I thought you could handle wisely. Marcus, you have the business skills to run the company. Elena, you have the social connections to manage properties successfully. But Benjamin has something none of you possess. He understands that true wealth isn't about what you accumulate, but what you create for others." The letter continued, "I've watched each of you for years. I've seen how you treat service workers, how you respond to people who have less than you do, how you define success. Benjamin alone has shown me that he understands what I spent my whole life learning, that we are only as rich as the lives we improve, only as successful as the problems we solve for others. The nonprofit he will inherit isn't just a charity project. It's a multi-million-dollar organization with sustainable funding, government contracts, and partnerships with major corporations committed to social responsibility. Benjamin will be the CEO of an organization dedicated to building affordable housing, providing job training, and creating sustainable communities. To those of you who measured Benjamin's inheritance by the appearance of an old toolbox, hope you'll take this opportunity to reconsider how you measure value in all areas of your lives. Benjamin didn't need me to give him wealth. He's been building it his whole life, one kind action at a time." When Benjamin finished reading, the room was completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Nobody knew what to say. The equations had all changed. The family dynamic had been turned completely upside down. Mr. Morrison was the first to speak. "Benjamin," he said with profound respect, "your grandfather asked me to tell you something in person, after you uncovered everything. He said, 'Tell that boy that every tool in that box came from a project that helped someone, and now it's his turn to fill it with new tools from his own projects.'" Benjamin nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by walking over to his uncle. "Marcus, I'm going to need advice about running a business," he said simply. "And Aunt Elena, I'll need help understanding property management. Aunt Victoria, you're great with budgets and organization. I hope we can work together." The gesture was so unexpected, so gracious after the humiliation they'd tried to inflict on him, that I saw tears in more than one person's eyes. Victoria, to her credit, stood up and hugged Benjamin. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I was wrong about everything." As we drove home that afternoon, in a car that would soon be replaced by something newer and safer, thanks to Benjamin's newfound financial security, my son turned to me with a smile I'll never forget. "You know what the best part is, Mom?" he said. "Grandpa Robert didn't just leave me money or property. He left me a purpose. He believed I could make a difference." That night, Benjamin spread all the documents across our small kitchen table, studying the business plan, making notes, beginning to understand the magnitude of what his grandfather had entrusted to him. But before he began work, he did something that reminded me exactly why he had been chosen for this inheritance. He called Mrs. Patterson, our elderly neighbor, and told her that her rent worries were over. The first property he was acquiring would be her building, and no longtime tenant would ever be displaced due to gentrification again. That old toolbox wasn't just about construction tools or hidden wealth. It was about building something that lasts, creating something meaningful, using whatever resources you have to make the world a little bit better. My father-in-law hadn't given his grandson money. He'd given him the tools to change lives. And watching Benjamin embrace that responsibility with such grace and determination, I realized that Robert Chen had chosen his heir perfectly. Some inheritances are counted in dollars. Others are measured in the lives they touch, the communities they build, the hope they create. My son had received the richest inheritance of all, the tools and the mission to make a lasting difference in the world. As I tucked Benjamin into bed that night, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed older, wiser than his 16 years. "Mom," he said, "Grandpa Robert once told me that the best inheritance isn't what you leave for your children, but what you leave in them." I think I finally understand what he meant. The boy who had quietly accepted his grandfather's gift that morning had become a young man with a massive responsibility by evening. But somehow, I knew he was ready for it. He'd been preparing his whole life for this moment, not by kissing up or playing politics, but by embodying the values that truly matter. The toolbox still sits in Benjamin's room, but now it's filling up with new tools. Documents for housing projects, business cards from potential partners, plans for sustainable communities. Every day he adds something new to it, just as his grandfather had done before him. And every day I'm reminded that the most valuable things in life can't be measured in bank account balances or property deeds. They can only be measured in the positive impact we make on others, the hope we create where none existed before, and the tools we pass on to the next generation to continue building a better world. That old toolbox taught us all a lesson that day. Sometimes the most precious inheritances come in the most humble packaging, and sometimes the worthiest heirs are the ones who value purpose over possessions, who choose service over self-interest, who understand that true wealth lies not in what you get, but in what you give. The ride home from the law office was unlike any car ride we'd ever taken. Usually, Benjamin would plug in his earbuds and do homework in the passenger seat while I navigated traffic, both of us comfortable in our familiar routine. But that day, he stared out the window with an expression I'd never seen before. Not shock exactly, but something deeper. Wonder mixed with responsibility, excitement tempered by the weight of understanding. "Pull over here, Mom," he said suddenly, as we passed Riverside Park. It was the same park where his grandfather had taught him to identify different types of wood by their grain patterns, where they'd sketched designs for birdhouses on napkins during summer picnics. I parked near the old oak tree where Robert Chen had carved his initials 60 years ago as a young immigrant determined to build something permanent in America. Benjamin got out and sat on a bench facing the lake, the leather portfolio of documents clutched in his hands. He wasn't reading them anymore. I think he'd memorized every word by now. Instead, he was looking across the water with the kind of focus that reminded me so much of his grandfather it made my chest ache. "You know what the crazy part is?" he said when I sat beside him. I knew. Not about the money or the property, but about this. He gestured vaguely at the documents. Grandpa Robert was always testing me, not with math problems or spelling bees, but with real life. "Remember when the Johnsons got evicted 3 years ago?" I nodded. The Johnsons had lived in our apartment complex for 15 years before losing everything in a medical bankruptcy. It had been heartbreaking to watch them pack their lives into boxes while their youngest cried about leaving his friends. "Grandpa, Robert drove me past their empty apartment that day," Benjamin continued. "He didn't say anything for the longest time. Then he asked me what I would do if I had the power to help families like them. I told him I'd build better apartments, ones people could afford even when life knocked them down. He just smiled and said, 'Remember that feeling, Ben. Remember exactly how it feels to want to fix something important.' A group of teenagers was playing frisbee near the shoreline, their laughter echoing across the water. Benjamin watched them for a moment before speaking again. I think that's when he decided. Not about the inheritance money, but about whether I understood what wealth is really for. And every conversation after that was like a masterclass in responsibility, disguised as grandpa talk. He opened the folder and pulled out a handwritten list in his grandfather's careful script. "Look at this," he said, showing me page after page of notes. He documented every interaction we ever had. Ben helped Mrs. Patterson carry groceries, didn't ask for thanks. Ben fixed Thompson's fence without being asked. Ben tutored struggling classmates instead of playing video games. My eyes filled with tears as I realized the depth of Robert Chen's observation. He hadn't just been a loving grandfather. He'd been studying Benjamin's character with the same methodical precision he'd once used to design bridges. "There's more," Benjamin said, flipping to the back pages. He wrote down every question I asked him about business, about helping people, about what happens when good people don't have enough money to solve their problems. And here. He pointed to a note dated just 3 months ago. Ben asked, "If success means being able to help more people or needing less help yourself, this boy understands the assignment." The assignment. That phrase hit me like lightning, because I remembered Robert Chen using those exact words after Benjamin's 14th birthday party. We'd had a small celebration at our apartment, nothing fancy, and Benjamin had given half of his birthday money to the food bank down the street. When Robert Chen got home that night, he called me to say, "That boy understands the assignment. Sarah, he gets what life is really about." Benjamin closed the folder carefully and leaned back against the bench. "I've been thinking about Uncle Marcus and Aunt Victoria," he said. "They weren't just being mean. They were measuring everything by the only standard they know, how much something costs versus how much status it gives you. They looked at that toolbox and saw $15 at a garage sale. They couldn't see what Grandpa Robert had spent, years putting inside it." A jogger passed us, earbuds in, focused on her fitness tracker. Benjamin observed her for a moment before saying, "I used to think rich people were just lucky, like they won some genetic lottery or got born into the right families. But Grandpa Robert showed me something different. He made his fortune because he understood that money is just a tool, like a hammer or a screwdriver. It can build something useful or it can break something valuable, depending on who's holding it and how they choose to use it." We sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set over the lake. Other families were packing up their picnic areas, calling their children away from the playground, heading home to evening routines. It struck me that none of them had any idea what had happened in that law office today. To them, Benjamin was still just another teenager from the modest apartment complex on the east side. They couldn't know he was now technically one of the wealthiest 16-year-olds in the state. "Mom, I want to ask you something," Benjamin said finally. "And I need you to be completely honest." I braced myself, unsure what was coming. "Do you think they'll treat us differently now? The family, our neighbors, people at school when word gets out?" It was such a mature question, tinged with the kind of wisdom that comes from growing up with less in a world that values more. I thought about Victoria's mocking laughter, Elena's patronizing sympathy, the twins taking photos for social media. I thought about how quickly their attitudes had changed when they realized what Benjamin had actually inherited. Honestly, some people will, I said. People who measure relationships by bank account balances. But the people who matter, the ones who've loved you for who you are, not what you have, those people will be excited for you. They'll want to know how they can help you succeed with this incredible opportunity. Benjamin nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that a lot. About who I want to become now that I have these resources. Because I could totally become one of those rich kids who thinks they're better than everyone else. I could start shopping at expensive stores and going to private schools and only hanging out with other wealthy people. He paused, picking up a smooth stone and skipping it across the water. It bounced 7 times before disappearing beneath the surface. But you know what I realized? That would be like taking Grandpa Robert's test and failing it on purpose. He didn't give me money to change who I am. He gave me tools to become who I already was, just on a bigger scale. Over the next several days, as news of Benjamin's inheritance began to spread through our community, his insight proved remarkably accurate. The responses fell into predictable categories, each reaction telling us more about the person giving it than about Benjamin or his situation. Our neighbor 3 doors down, Mrs. Patterson, cried when Benjamin told her that her building would be the first property in his affordable housing portfolio. She'd been worried about rent increases and potential eviction notices, fears that had kept her awake at night for months. "Your grandfather raised you, right?" she said, hugging Benjamin with tears streaming down her face. "He'd be so proud." The teenagers from Benjamin's high school reacted with a mixture of awe and awkwardness. Some of his closest friends were genuinely excited, already brainstorming ways they could help with his housing projects or volunteer for his nonprofit. Others seemed uncomfortable, as if friendship with someone suddenly wealthy required a different rulebook they hadn't learned. But it was the reaction of our extended family, the Chen relatives who had initially mocked Benjamin's inheritance, that proved most interesting. Marcus called 3 times in 2 days, each conversation a masterclass in awkward backpedaling. "I hope you know we were just surprised," he said during the last call. "Dad always had a flair for the dramatic. We should have expected something like this." Victoria sent a lengthy text message that was equal parts apology and attempt to save face. "Benjamin, your grandfather was obviously saving the best surprise for last. I'm sorry if my reaction seemed inappropriate. I was just shocked by how brilliant his planning was." Elena took a different approach entirely, calling to offer assistance. "You'll need help with the property management side of things," she said. "I've been thinking that our firms could partner on some projects, family working with family." The twins posted a new video, this one titled, "When Your Cousin Becomes a Millionaire Overnight." The content had shifted from mockery to admiration, though something about their enthusiasm felt performative, as if they were auditioning for roles in Benjamin's new life story. But perhaps the most telling conversation came from Benjamin's father, who hadn't been present at the will reading and hadn't spoken to Benjamin in over 2 years. He called on a Saturday morning, his voice carrying the fake cheerfulness of someone trying to restart a relationship for entirely self-serving reasons. "Ben, buddy, I heard about Grandpa Robert's will. That's incredible news." Benjamin listened politely as his father talked about how proud he was, how he'd always known Benjamin was special, how they should get together soon to catch up. The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost embarrassing. When the call ended, Benjamin looked at me with an expression that seemed decades older than his years. "He called me Buddy," he said quietly. "He's never called me Buddy in my life. I guess being rich changes how some people see you, even when they're supposed to love you no matter what." We spent that weekend working in Benjamin's room, converting it into a makeshift office where he could begin managing his new responsibilities. We cleared out old textbooks and sports equipment, replacing them with filing cabinets and a large corkboard where he could visualize his first housing project. As we worked, Benjamin shared more details about his conversations with his grandfather, stories I'd never heard before. "He used to tell me about coming to America with $40 and 2 suitcases," Benjamin said, carefully organizing documents. "But he never talked about being poor. He talked about being unbuilt, like a construction site where you can see the blueprint but not the finished building yet." He pulled out a photograph I'd never seen, his grandfather as a young man, standing next to a half-built house, tools in hand, dirt under his fingernails. He said this picture represented his philosophy. You start with tools, add knowledge and hard work, and eventually, you create something that shelters other people. That's what wealth should do. It should shelter people. Monday morning brought our first real challenge. Benjamin had a meeting with Mr. Morrison to begin the legal process of taking control of his inheritance. As his mother and legal guardian, I would need to be involved in every major decision. But the will had been structured to give Benjamin significant autonomy as he approached 18. The law firm felt different this time. Same polished floors, same expensive art on the walls, but now we walked through with our heads high. The receptionist who had barely acknowledged us the week before now offered coffee and made sure we were comfortable in the waiting room. Mr. Morrison greeted us like valued clients, which I suppose we now were. "Benjamin," he said, shaking hands, with genuine warmth, "I've had time to review everything your grandfather prepared. The scope of this inheritance is truly remarkable, not just in terms of value, but in terms of vision." He led us to a different conference room, one with windows overlooking the Sound and Mount Rainier visible in the distance. Spread across the mahogany table were architectural drawings, demographic studies, environmental impact assessments, and financial projections. "Your grandfather spent 3 years preparing this transition," Mr. Morrison explained. "This wasn't just estate planning, it was succession planning. He identified key properties, researched sustainable building materials, established relationships with community leaders and government officials. He even had preliminary meetings with several major corporations about partnership opportunities." Benjamin studied the materials with the concentration of a graduate student, asking questions that impressed even the experienced lawyer. "What about workforce development? I see the job training component mentioned here, but how deep does it go?" Mr. Morrison smiled. "I'm glad you asked. Your grandfather established partnerships with 3 technical colleges and 2 unions. The plan includes apprenticeship programs, certification courses, and what he called second chance hiring practices for people re-entering the workforce. As the meeting progressed, I watched Benjamin transform from a 16-year-old trying to process an overwhelming inheritance into something closer to a young CEO understanding his mission. He took notes in a careful script reminiscent of his grandfather's handwriting. He asked for clarification on legal terms, but grasped complex financial concepts intuitively. "There's one more thing," Mr. Morrison said toward the end of our meeting. "Your grandfather left specific instructions for your first year. He suggested starting with one small project to test your systems and processes before scaling up. He actually identified the property he thought you should begin with." He slid a folder across the table containing photos and documentation for a small apartment complex in the University District, 15 units, built in the 1960s, currently owned by a landlord with a reputation for exploiting international students and young professionals. "The building needs extensive renovation," Mr. Morrison continued. "It's a perfect opportunity to implement your grandfather's vision on a manageable scale. Affordable housing, sustainable materials, good jobs for local workers, and a test case for policies that could be expanded across larger projects." Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos of peeling paint, broken windows, and a parking lot full of potholes. Then he looked up with a smile that reminded me so much of his grandfather it took my breath away. "When can we start?" The next few weeks blurred together in a whirlwind of meetings, inspections, and planning sessions. Benjamin threw himself into learning everything he could about construction, property management, sustainable materials, and community development. He read voraciously, watched countless YouTube tutorials, and peppered every expert he met with questions. But what impressed me most was how he never lost sight of the human element. When we visited the apartment complex for the first time, he insisted on introducing himself to every tenant. He listened to their complaints about broken appliances and inconsistent heating. He asked about their dreams and challenges, their hopes for their children, their fears about displacement. "I'm not here to kick anyone out," he assured Mrs. Gonzalez, a nurse whose family had lived in the building for 8 years. "I'm here to make this place somewhere you'd choose to stay, not somewhere you're stuck." One afternoon, as Benjamin worked on his laptop at our kitchen table, surrounded by architectural plans and budget spreadsheets, I realized how much he'd grown in just a month. The boy who had quietly accepted his grandfather's toolbox had evolved into a young man who understood the weight of his inheritance, not just the financial weight, but the moral weight. "Mom," he said suddenly, looking up from his computer, "I want to show you something." He turned the screen toward me, revealing a design he'd been working on with the architects. It was a blueprint for the renovated apartment complex, but it wasn't just about buildings. He'd incorporated community spaces, a children's playground, raised garden beds, and even a small workshop where residents could borrow tools and work on their own projects. "See this space here?" He pointed to a large room on the ground floor. "I want to call it the Robert Chen Community Center. Not because I want to put a plaque with Grandpa's name on it, but because I want it to represent everything he believed in. Tools and knowledge available to anyone who needs them. A place where people can learn new skills, start small businesses, help each other." Tears sprang to my eyes as I realized what he'd created. It wasn't just an apartment complex, it was a community. A place where people could find more than just affordable housing. They could find opportunity, support, and hope. "There's something else," Benjamin said, his voice carrying a note of excitement. "Remember how Uncle Marcus got the construction company? Well, I've been talking to him about a partnership. Not because I need his help, but because I think he needs mine." I raised an eyebrow, remembering Marcus's initial reaction to Benjamin's inheritance. "The company has been struggling with larger competitors who can underbid them on major projects," Benjamin explained. "But they're perfect for the kind of work I want to do. Smaller, more personal projects where quality matters more than speed. I'm thinking about offering them all the construction work for my housing projects. It would give them stable, long-term contracts and help them stay competitive." It was a brilliant strategy, one that would help the family business while advancing Benjamin's mission. But more than that, it was an act of forgiveness and reconciliation, a way of turning the hurt from that day in the law office into something constructive. That evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Benjamin's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it and smiled, showing me the screen. It was from Marcus. "Ben, your mom told Victoria about your partnership idea. We'd love to discuss it further. Also, I owe you an apology. Dad didn't raise us to judge people by what they have. He raised us to judge them by what they do with what they have. Proud of you, nephew." As I watched Benjamin type a gracious response, I marveled at the young man he was becoming. Robert Chen had seen something in his grandson that the rest of us had missed, not just kindness or intelligence, but the rare combination of vision and humility that makes truly great leaders. That night, Benjamin fell asleep at his desk, head pillowed on architectural plans and financial projections. I covered him with a blanket and turned off his laptop, but not before I saw what was on the screen. A detailed timeline for his first year as a housing developer, complete with milestones, budget allocations, and community outreach goals. At the bottom of the document, in the footers where he probably thought no one would look, was a single line that made my heart swell with pride. What would Grandpa Robert do? He wasn't just inheriting money or property or even a mission. He was inheriting a way of thinking, a way of measuring success, a way of using whatever tools life gave him to build something meaningful. The boy who had been mocked for his worthless inheritance was learning that true worth can't be calculated on any balance sheet. It's measured in lives changed, communities strengthened, and hope created where none existed before. And in mastering that lesson, Benjamin was proving himself worthy of every single tool his grandfather had left him, both the ones in that old red toolbox and the ones that would shape his future. 3 months into what I now think of as Benjamin's transformation from teenager to visionary, we stood together on the construction site of his first housing project. The November morning was crisp, with fog rolling in from Puget Sound, and The sound of hammers and power tools created a symphony of progress that would have made Robert Chen's heart soar. Benjamin was reviewing blueprints with Tommy Martinez, the construction foreman Marcus had recommended, a man in his 50s who'd worked for Chen Construction for over 20 years. What struck me wasn't just Benjamin's growing fluency with architectural terms and building codes, but how the seasoned workers on the job site had begun to genuinely respect him. "Your grandfather would flip his lid if he saw this solar design," Tommy was saying, pointing to the roof plans. "Back in our day, we were just figuring out how to make buildings energy efficient. You've designed something that actually gives energy back to the grid." Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. "Grandpa Robert used to say that every building should leave the world better than it found it. I figure that includes the environment, too." As we walked through the construction site, I marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. The old apartment complex had been completely gutted, revealing the strong bones beneath years of neglect. New windows were being installed, triple-paned, energy-efficient models that would dramatically reduce heating costs for future tenants. The sight of workers carefully installing solar panels reminded me that this wasn't just renovation. It was revolution. "Mrs. Chen?" called out Maria Santos, one of the project managers Benjamin had hired. She was a recent graduate from the University of Washington's Construction Management program, and Benjamin had specifically sought out women and minorities for leadership roles in his company. "The community garden installation team is here." Benjamin wanted to check the layout before they start. We followed her to the back of the property, where a group of volunteers from the neighborhood was preparing to install raised garden beds. Among them, I recognized several faces: teenagers from Benjamin's high school, residents from nearby apartments, and even some elderly volunteers from local community centers. What surprised me most was seeing Victoria there, wearing actual work clothes and dirt under her manicured nails. She looked up as we approached, offering a smile that seemed genuinely warm rather than obligatory. "Benjamin asked if I wanted to help design the garden's irrigation system," she explained, slightly embarrassed. "I majored in landscape architecture before I switched to business. I haven't done this kind of work in 15 years, but it's actually fun." Benjamin beamed at his aunt. "The community garden wasn't even in the original plans," he told me. "But when we were talking to future tenants about what they wanted most, so many people mentioned wanting space to grow their own food. So we redesigned the whole backyard." I watched as Benjamin consulted with Mrs. Gonzalez, the nurse who had lived in the old building for 8 years. She was enthusiastically showing him sketches for a children's play area that would be visible from the garden, allowing parents to supervise their kids while tending to their plants. "Your grandfather used to tell me that America gave him space to plant seeds for his future," Mrs. Gonzalez said to Benjamin. "Now you're giving me space to literally plant seeds with my children. It's like the circle completing itself." Profound simplicity of her observation hit me like a lightning bolt. Robert Chen had immigrated with nothing but tools and determination, planting metaphorical seeds that had grown into a construction empire. Now his grandson was creating actual spaces for new immigrants and struggling families to plant literal seeds, growing food that would nourish both their bodies and their sense of community. As the morning progressed, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Jennifer Park, a social worker from the University District, who was studying Benjamin's project as a model for community-driven development. She was documenting everything with eager excitement, taking photos and conducting interviews with residents and workers. "Your son is pioneering something remarkable here," she told me. "Most affordable housing projects are designed by people who have never lived in affordable housing. Benjamin is different. He's not imposing his vision on a community. He's helping the community express its own vision." Dr. Park showed me her notes, filled with quotes from residents and observations about the project's unique approach. "Look at this," she said, flipping to a page covered with colorful diagrams. "Instead of a traditional landlord-tenant relationship, Benjamin is creating what he calls a cooperative ownership pathway. Residents can gradually buy shares in their units, building equity over time. The innovation of it took my breath away. Benjamin had studied the economics of poverty and realized that rent payments, no matter how affordable, never build wealth for families. So he'd designed a system where monthly payments could eventually result in ownership, creating a pathway from poverty to property ownership. That afternoon, Benjamin had scheduled a meeting with the first group of potential residents. We gathered in what would eventually be the community center, currently just a large empty room with concrete floors and newly installed windows. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and Benjamin had prepared packets of information for each family. As people filed in, I was struck by the diversity of the group. There was Ahmed Hassan, a refugee from Somalia who worked 2 jobs while studying for his engineering degree. Maria Delgado brought her 3 children, including a daughter with cerebral palsy who would benefit from the building's accessibility features. Jonathan Wright, a veteran dealing with PTSD, attended with his service dog. The Chen family, no relation to us, had recently immigrated from Taiwan and spoke limited English, but communicated fluently through their teenage daughter. Benjamin stood before this group with a confidence that still amazed me. First, I want to thank you all for trusting me with something as important as your homes. Second, I want you to know that this isn't my project, it's ours. He gestured to a large board covered with sticky notes, photos, and sketches. Every design choice we've made came from conversations with you. The extra-wide hallways for Mrs. Delgado's daughter's wheelchair. The soundproofing between units for Mr. Wright's service dog. The enlarged balconies because the Hassan family mentioned their grandmother liked to garden. What happened next was unlike any housing development meeting I'd ever imagined. Benjamin opened the floor for questions and suggestions, and rather than fielding complaints or concerns, he facilitated a discussion about community building. How would residents prefer to handle shared spaces? What kind of programming might they want in the community center? How could different families support each other? Ahmed Hassan raised his hand. In Somalia, we had a tradition called Isbaro, community gathering times where neighbors would share food and skills. Could we maybe schedule regular potluck dinners in the community center? Before Benjamin could respond, Maria Delgado was nodding enthusiastically. My family does something similar, we call it Minga. Everyone contributes what they can, whether it's food, childcare, or helping with practical tasks. Soon, the room was buzzing with ideas. The Chen family offered to organize weekend language exchange sessions. Jonathan Wright, drawing on his military experience, suggested starting a community emergency preparedness program. Each suggestion built on the previous one, creating an organic blueprint for community life. Benjamin listened intently, occasionally making notes but mostly just facilitating the conversation. When there was finally a lull, he stood again. Here's what I'm hearing, he said. You don't just want nice apartments. You want to belong to something bigger. You want to create the kind of neighborhood where your children can thrive and your grandparents feel valued. Nods and murmurs of agreement filled the room. So here's what I'm proposing, Benjamin continued. In addition to the cooperative ownership pathway, we establish a community council. Residents make decisions together about shared spaces, programming, and even some building policies. I'll facilitate and provide resources, but this community belongs to you. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Delgado started crying. Tears of joy, she quickly clarified. Ahmed Hassan stood up and shook Benjamin's hand with both of his own. The Chen family's teenager translated rapidly for her parents, who smiled broadly and nodded enthusiastically. After the meeting, as people mingled and children played in the space that would soon be their home, I found myself talking with Jonathan Wright. He was a quiet man in his 30s, his service dog Eagle lying calmly at his feet. You know what's different about your son? He asked thoughtfully. Most people see us as problems to be solved. He sees us as assets to be activated. The wisdom in that observation stayed with me as we drove home that evening. Benjamin spent the ride reviewing his notes from the meeting, already planning how to incorporate the community's ideas into the project's final phases. "Mom," he said suddenly, "I want to tell you about something Grandpa Robert once said to me. It was last Christmas, when we were working on that jewelry box for you. I remembered that Christmas gift, a beautifully crafted wooden box with multiple compartments and a secret drawer that Benjamin had spent months learning to make. He told me that the real test of a carpenter isn't how perfectly they can follow a blueprint," Benjamin continued. "It's how well they can adapt when they discover something unexpected, like when we found that knot in the wood that looked like a flaw but ended up making the grain pattern more beautiful." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, watching the city, lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening darkness. "I think that's what this project is teaching me. All these different families with their different needs and stories, they're not complications to overcome. They're like that knot in the wood. They make the final result more beautiful than anything I could have planned alone." The next morning brought news that would test Benjamin's resilience in ways none of us had anticipated. Mr. Morrison called early, his voice carrying an edge of concern. "Benjamin, we need to discuss something immediately. There's been a development with your uncle's company." Within an hour, we were back in the familiar conference room at Morrison & Associates. Marcus was already there, along with his lawyer and what appeared to be several financial advisors. The atmosphere was tense in a way I hadn't felt since the original will reading. "What's going on?" Benjamin asked, taking a seat across from his uncle. Marcus looked exhausted, older than his years. "The company is in trouble, Ben. Serious trouble. We overextended on 3 major projects last year, and now we're looking at potential bankruptcy." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Benjamin had been counting on Chen Construction for all his housing projects. More than that, he'd seen the partnership as a way to strengthen family ties and honor his grandfather's legacy. "How bad is it?" Benjamin asked quietly. Marcus's lawyer, a stern woman in her 50s, laid out the situation with painful clarity. Overruns on a commercial project in Bellevue, a residential development that had encountered unexpected environmental regulations, a shopping center renovation where the client had filed a lawsuit claiming defective work. "We're looking at approximately $8 million in debt," she concluded. "Without immediate capital infusion, we'll have to file for bankruptcy within 60 days. The room fell silent. I could see Benjamin's mind working, processing not just the financial implications but the human ones. Jobs would be lost. Workers like Tommy Martinez, who'd spent decades building the company's reputation, would lose their livelihoods. "What if," Benjamin said slowly, "instead of a partnership, we talked about an acquisition?" Marcus looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if Chen Development, my company, bought Chen Construction? We could maintain the workforce, honor existing contracts, and restructure the debt. The construction company becomes a subsidiary focused specifically on affordable housing and community development projects." The legal and financial implications were complex, requiring extensive discussion between lawyers and accountants. But as the conversation evolved, I watched something beautiful happen. Benjamin wasn't just solving a business problem, he was preserving his grandfather's legacy while transforming it for a new generation. "There would be conditions," Benjamin said firmly. "All workers would retain their jobs and benefits. The company would commit to fair labor practices and environmental sustainability, and there would be a profit-sharing program so the people building these communities would benefit directly from their success." Marcus sat back in his chair, looking both relieved and humbled. "Ben, I don't know what to say. A few months ago, I was mocking your inheritance. Now you're offering to save everything Dad built. I'm not saving it. Benjamin corrected gently. I'm helping it evolve. Grandpa Robert didn't build a construction company just to make money. He built it to create homes for people. We're just expanding that mission. Over the following weeks, the acquisition process moved forward with surprising speed. Benjamin assembled a team of advisors that included Dr. Park, the social worker studying his project, several experts in cooperative business models, and even Victoria, whose business acumen proved invaluable in structuring the deal. I watched my son navigate complex negotiations with wisdom far beyond his years. He insisted on involving workers in the restructuring process, holding multiple meetings to ensure their voices were heard. He established an innovation fund encouraging employees to suggest improvements in both processes and worker conditions. Most remarkably, he convinced several of his grandfather's old business contacts to invest in the new combined company. These weren't people motivated solely by profit. They were individuals who had been touched by Robert Chen's integrity and wanted to see his vision continue. The day Benjamin signed the final papers making him the owner of both Chen Development and Chen Construction, we held a celebration at the construction site of his first housing project. Workers from both companies attended, along with future residents and community leaders. Tommy Martinez, now the senior foreman for the combined companies, presented Benjamin with a gift, a restored tool that had belonged to his grandfather, one of the first hammers Robert Chen had used when he started the construction company decades ago. Your grandfather gave this to me when I started working for him 25 years ago, Tommy explained. He told me it was a reminder that every building starts with a single nail, struck true. I think he'd want you to have it back now. Benjamin accepted the hammer with reverence, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He hefted it in his hand, feeling its familiar weight, then looked out at the crowd of workers, residents, and family members gathered around him. Grandpa Robert once told me that the best tools are the ones that have built the most, he said. This hammer has built thousands of homes, created countless jobs, and helped shape communities across the state. But its work isn't done. He gestured to the construction site around us, where walls were rising and dreams were taking physical form. Every tool in my grandfather's toolbox came with a history and a future. This hammer is going to help build affordable homes. These workers are going to create communities where families can thrive. And together, we're going to prove that Grandpa Robert's most important lesson was true. Real wealth isn't what you accumulate for yourself. It's what you help others build for themselves. As applause filled the air, I looked around at the faces surrounding my son. Ahmed Hassan stood with his engineering textbooks tucked under his arm, already talking to contractors about potential job opportunities. Mrs. Delgado was showing another mother the playground designs, both women laughing, as their children played in the construction dust. Jonathan Wright was deep in conversation with Tommy Martinez about adapting tools for workers with disabilities. This wasn't just a construction site anymore. It wasn't even just a housing development. It was a community in the truest sense. People from different backgrounds and circumstances coming together to build something none of them could create alone. That evening, as Benjamin and I drove home past the Seattle skyline, he was unusually quiet. Finally, as we stopped at a red light near Pike Place Market, he spoke. Mom, do you ever wonder what Grandpa Robert would think of all this? I considered the question carefully. I think he'd be proud that you understood the lesson. But more than that, I think he'd be amazed at how you've expanded it. He saw potential in you that even he might not have fully realized. Benjamin nodded slowly. I've been thinking about his toolbox again, about how he hid all those surprises in secret compartments. I'm starting to think the real inheritance wasn't the money or property or even the nonprofit plans. The light turned green, and as we drove on, he continued. The real inheritance was the mindset. The understanding that everything you have, every tool, every skill, every opportunity, is given to you not to keep, but to use in service of something bigger than yourself. As we pulled into our apartment complex parking lot, Benjamin pointed to a small group of kids playing basketball under the streetlights. They were speaking a mixture of English, Spanish, and Somali, their different languages blending into the universal language of childhood laughter. "That's what I want to build everywhere," he said softly. "Places where different people come together and create something beautiful." Looking back now, I realize that night marked the end of Benjamin's transition from recipient to creator. The boy who had quietly accepted his grandfather's toolbox had become a man determined to fill it with new tools, new projects, and new hope for communities that had been overlooked for too long. The mocking he'd endured in that law office had transformed into motivation. The worthless inheritance had revealed its true value. And the grandson who had been deemed unworthy by some family members had proven himself worthy in ways that mattered far more than bank account balances. Robert Chen had built more than homes in his lifetime. He had built a legacy. And Benjamin was proving that the best legacies aren't preserved in museums or written in history books. They're lived out daily, hammered into existence with tools, both old and new, creating spaces where people can grow, thrive, and build their own dreams. 1 year after the will reading, Benjamin stood before the Seattle City Council, presenting Chen Development's model for sustainable, affordable housing to Mayor Jenny Durkin and 12 council members who held the power to change housing policy for the entire city. The boy who had been mocked for inheriting a simple toolbox was now being courted by political leaders eager to understand how he'd created something that seemed impossible. Profitable, affordable housing that actually benefited the community. "Councilwoman Taylor," Benjamin addressed the debate happening before him, "with respect, I disagree that public-private partnerships always benefit the private party more than the public. Let me show you our numbers." The confidence in his voice still amazed me. This was the same teenager who'd sat quietly in that law office, holding his grandfather's toolbox while relatives snickered about his worthless inheritance. Now he commanded the attention of some of the most powerful people in the city, armed with real data and practical solutions that could transform how Seattle approached affordable housing. "In our first project," Benjamin continued, advancing, "to the next slide, we achieved 100% capacity within 3 months, with a waiting list of over 500 families. Average tenant income increased by 32% within the first year due to our job training programs and partnerships with local employers. And here's the key metric. Not a single family has been displaced due to inability to pay rent." Councilwoman Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, skeptics would say that one successful project doesn't prove a replicable model. How do you scale compassion?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Benjamin smiled, not the polite smile of a teenager trying to please adults, but the confident expression of someone who'd been building solutions faster than he'd been collecting problems. "You don't scale compassion, Councilwoman. You scale systems that allow compassion to thrive." He clicked to the next slide, revealing a comprehensive plan for 15 more housing developments across Seattle's most underserved neighborhoods. Each project starts with extensive community input. We don't design housing and then find people to fill it. We work with communities to design spaces that address their specific needs and aspirations. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, with Benjamin fielding questions that would have challenged seasoned developers. He discussed financing mechanisms that protected both investors and residents. He outlined job creation numbers that excited labor representatives. He detailed environmental impact reductions that impressed sustainability advocates. But what captured the room's attention most was a video testimonial from Ahmed Hassan, the refugee who'd been among the first residents of Benjamin's project. Ahmed appeared on screen in his work clothes, a hard hat tucked under his arm. 6 months ago, I was working 2 minimum wage jobs just to afford a studio apartment where my family couldn't even cook traditional meals because the ventilation was so poor. Today, I'm an assistant project manager for Chen Construction. We live in a 3-bedroom apartment with a kitchen where my grandmother can make injera bread without setting off smoke alarms. and my children play in a garden where they're learning to grow vegetables from our homeland. The screen showed footage of children playing in the community garden, elderly residents sharing stories on benches designed for multi-generational gathering, young adults studying together in the community center that was open 24 hours because residents requested flexibility for those working non-traditional schedules. But perhaps most importantly, Ahmed continued, my children see me building homes for other families like ours. They understand that work can be about more than just earning money. It can be about creating hope. When the video ended, the council chamber was silent. Then Mayor Durkin began to clap, followed by the entire council and the dozens of community members who'd come to support Benjamin's proposal. Councilman Williams, who'd seemed skeptical throughout the presentation, leaned into his microphone. Mr. Chen, you're asking the city to commit significant resources to replicate your model citywide. What guarantees do we have that this isn't just young idealism that will crash against real-world economics? Benjamin nodded, clearly expecting this question. Councilman Williams, my grandfather used to say that idealism without practicality is just dreaming, but practicality without idealism is just existing. We've run the numbers extensively. He gestured to Maria Santos, his project manager, who'd accompanied him to the hearing. She distributed thick folders to each council member. Those packets contain 5-year financial projections, independently, verified by 3 different accounting firms, Benjamin explained. They show not just sustainability, but profitability. More importantly, they demonstrate reduced costs for the city in terms of social services, emergency interventions, and law enforcement. Maria stood to elaborate. When people have stable, affordable housing connected to job opportunities and community support, they need fewer city services. Our model actually saves taxpayers money while improving quality of life for vulnerable residents. The data was compelling, but what sealed the deal was the parade of residents, workers, and community leaders who spoke during the public comment period. Mrs. Delgado explained how her daughter's physical therapy requirements had been incorporated into the building design, allowing her child to thrive in ways that had seemed impossible before. Tommy Martinez described how the worker ownership component had motivated his crew to achieve unprecedented quality standards because they directly benefited from the project's success. But it was the testimony of Dr. Jennifer Park, the social worker who'd been studying Benjamin's model, that provided the academic credibility the council needed. In 30 years of social work and urban planning research, she told the council, I've never seen a housing development that so effectively addresses the root causes of community poverty. This isn't just about shelter. It's about creating circumstances where families can build wealth, children can exceed their parents' educational achievements, and communities can become self-sustaining. The vote was unanimous, 12-0 in favor of the Chen Development Partnership. Outside the council chambers, Benjamin was surrounded by journalists, community activists, and developers eager to understand how a 17-year-old had created what seasoned professionals had deemed impossible. But what struck me most was how he handled the attention. This success belongs to everyone who believed in the vision, he told a reporter from the Seattle Times. Every resident who trusted us with their home, every worker who brought their skills to the project, every community leader who advocated for change. I was just the person who happened to inherit the tools to make it possible. That evening, we held a celebration at the original Chen Development Project. The community center was packed with residents, workers, city officials, and family members. Children ran between tables laden with food, representing dozens of different cultures. Ahmed's wife had taught Mrs. Delgado to make Somali samosas. The Chen family from Taiwan shared their recipe for sticky rice cakes. Jonathan Wright contributed his grandmother's cornbread recipe. As I watched Benjamin move through the crowd, hugging residents, discussing future projects with city officials, and playing with children who saw him as the good-natured young man who sometimes helped with homework rather than their landlord, I thought about how far we'd all come. Marcus approached me, a beer in hand, and a smile that seemed genuine rather than obligatory. "Sarah," he said, "I owe you an apology, too. I spent years thinking your side of the family was the weak link. I couldn't see past our own prejudices about what success looks like." He gestured toward Benjamin, who was currently showing a group of teenagers from the community how to read architectural drawings. "Look at him. Dad saw something in that boy that the rest of us missed entirely. He's not just successful, he's changing what success means." Victoria joined our conversation, appearing more relaxed than I'd seen her since the will reading. "I've been thinking a lot about that day," she admitted. "About the cruel things I said. I was so focused on dollar amounts that I couldn't see value. You've raised an extraordinary young man, Sarah." She paused, watching Benjamin help an elderly Somali woman navigate something on a tablet computer. "I've learned more about real wealth in the past year than I did in the previous 40. And I know now that Benjamin didn't just inherit money from Robert. He inherited purpose." As the evening progressed, Benjamin was invited to speak. He climbed onto a small stage where a local band had been playing, raising his hands for attention. As the music quieted, "A little over a year ago," he began, "I sat in a law office holding what appeared to be a worthless old toolbox while family members debated its value. Some of you were there. You remember." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus and Victoria exchanged glances, their expressions showing both embarrassment and admiration. "That toolbox taught me something I want to share with you tonight," Benjamin continued. "Its value wasn't in what it appeared to be worth to outside observers. Its value was in what it could become when placed in the right hands with the right purpose." He gestured around the room, encompassing all the faces looking up at him. Residents who'd found stable homes, workers who'd gained job security and ownership stakes, children who played in safe spaces designed specifically for them. Every person in this room brought tools to this project. Ahmed brought engineering skills and cultural wisdom. Mrs. Delgado brought experience navigating systems with a disabled child. The Chen family brought linguistic abilities and business knowledge. Tommy brought construction expertise and worker perspective. Dr. Park brought research skills and academic credibility. Benjamin's voice grew stronger, more impassioned. "My grandfather's lesson wasn't that some people deserve more than others. It was that everyone has tools to contribute. And when we combine those tools toward a common purpose, we can build things. That seemed impossible alone." He pulled out the restored hammer Tommy Martinez had given him months earlier. This hammer helped build thousands of homes over decades. But it's just a tool. Its value came from the hands that wielded it, the purposes it served, the lives it improved. Benjamin looked directly at several family members in the crowd. "I forgive everyone who doubted this inheritance's value, because you helped me understand something crucial. Real worth isn't determined by the judgment of others. It's determined by what you do with what you've been given." The applause was thunderous, but Benjamin wasn't finished. "Moving forward, Chen Development isn't just my company. It belongs to everyone who helps build it. We're implementing shared ownership across all our projects. Residents, workers, community partners. Everyone who contributes will benefit directly from our success." The announcement surprised even me. Over the past months, Benjamin had been working with lawyers and economists to develop an innovative model where multiple stakeholders could own shares in housing developments. It was revolutionary, a system that could fundamentally change how wealth was distributed in community development projects. "Grandpa Robert's toolbox is still in my room," Benjamin concluded. "But it's no longer the same toolbox he gave me. It's filling up with new tools. Tools contributed by every person who's joined this mission. Tools for measuring impact rather than just profit. Tools for building community rather than just structures. Tools for creating wealth that belongs to the people who create it." The celebration continued late into the night. Children fell asleep in parents' arms, while adults discussed plans for future projects. City officials exchanged contact information with community leaders. Former skeptics asked thoughtful questions about replicating the model in other neighborhoods. Around midnight, as I helped clean up the community center, I found Benjamin sitting quietly in the children's reading corner, surrounded by picture books in multiple languages. He was holding a worn photograph I'd seen countless times, his grandfather as a young man, standing proudly in front of his first completed house project in America. "Tired?" I asked, settling beside him. "Not tired," he said thoughtfully. "Grateful, and maybe a little overwhelmed by what comes next." Indeed, the next phase would bring challenges none of us had anticipated. Success breeds scrutiny, and Benjamin's model was attracting attention from developers who wanted to replicate the profits without the community focus, politicians who saw opportunity for grandstanding, and critics who questioned whether such idealistic approaches could survive economic downturns. But that night, surrounded by the community he'd helped create, Benjamin seemed ready for whatever came next. "You know what I've realized?" he said, carefully placing the photograph in a new frame he'd commissioned, one made by a resident who'd started a woodworking business in the community center's workshop. "Grandpa Robert didn't just leave me an inheritance. He left me a responsibility. And every day, I get to choose whether I'm worthy of that responsibility." As we walked home through Seattle's quiet streets, passing apartment buildings that represented both failures and successes in the city's housing history, Benjamin carried himself differently than he had a year ago, not with arrogance or entitlement, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd discovered his purpose. 2 months later, Benjamin was invited to speak at a national housing conference in Washington, D.C. Standing before an audience of housing secretaries, nonprofit leaders, and policy experts from around the country, he displayed none of the nervousness one might expect from an 18-year-old addressing some of the most influential people in American housing policy. "The greatest poverty," he told the assembly, "isn't the lack of money. It's the lack of opportunity to build something meaningful with your life. When we create housing that connects people to jobs, education, and community, we're not just solving homelessness, we're unleashing human potential." The speech was live-streamed, garnering over 2 million views within 48 hours. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about what housing could be when developed with community input rather than imposed by distant professionals. Back in Seattle, our original housing project had become a destination for social workers, urban planners, and politicians from around the world. 3 documentaries were in production, studying different aspects of Benjamin's model. A major university had established a research center on community-driven development, with Benjamin serving as a youth advisor. Yet despite the attention and accolades, Benjamin remained focused on the work itself. He spent most days on construction, sites, in community meetings, or in the offices of Chen Development, which had grown to employ over 200 people across various skills. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, as we sat in his office reviewing applications for the 5th Chen Development project, I watched him study each family's story with the same careful attention he'd once given to his grandfather's woodworking projects. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, pointing to one application. "Single mother, works night shifts as a security guard, 3 kids. She'd benefit from the 24-hour childcare co-op we're planning for the Beacon Hill project." He moved to the next file. "The Nguyen family. They're catering specialists but don't have licensing for a commercial kitchen. Perfect for the food business incubator component." Each application wasn't just evaluated by income requirements and credit scores, but by how the applicant could contribute to and benefit from the community being created. Maria Santos, now Benjamin's partner in running the company, brought in a stack of new resumes. "We're having trouble keeping up with demands from workers wanting to join us," she reported. "Word has spread that working for Chen companies means actual ownership stakes and profit sharing. We received over 500 applications last week for 12 positions." It was a good problem to have, but it highlighted how unique Benjamin's approach remained in the construction industry. Most companies still operated on traditional models where profits flowed upward while risks were borne by those at the bottom. That evening, Benjamin announced he had something special to show us at the original project site. As Maria and I followed him through the familiar hallways, we noticed new artwork on the walls, pieces created by residents in collaboration with a local arts collective. Benjamin led us to what had once been a storage closet near the community center. He'd had it converted into something that took my breath away, a replica of his grandfather's original workshop, complete with authentic tools from the 1950s and 60s. "I wanted to preserve this," he explained, running his hands over a workbench that looked identical to the one in Robert Chen's old workshop. Not as a museum, but as a reminder. Kids can come here to learn traditional woodworking. Adults can use the space for small furniture projects or repairs. But the most striking feature was the wall display, his grandfather's original toolbox, now permanently mounted and surrounded by tools contributed by community members. Each tool had a small plaque identifying its donor and the project it had helped complete. "Look at this," Benjamin said, pointing to a worn chisel. "Ahmed donated this. He used it to help install the custom cabinetry in the community kitchen. And this one," he indicated a paintbrush with a worn handle. "Mrs. Delgado used this to paint the mural in the children's play area." The display was beautiful, but more than that, it was meaningful. Each tool represented someone who'd contributed to building something larger than themselves. As I examined the collection, I noticed a small envelope tucked behind the original toolbox. Benjamin saw me looking and smiled. "Grandpa Robert's final surprise," he explained. "Mr. Morrison gave it to me 6 months ago, with instructions to open it only when the first project was completed and fully occupied." He carefully extracted a handwritten letter, this one shorter than the others but somehow more profound. "Benjamin," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, you succeeded in your first test, not the test of creating affordable housing. That was just the mechanism. The real test was whether you could take other people's judgments about worth and transform them into motivation for creating actual worth." Benjamin paused, his voice thick with emotion. "You have proven that inheritance isn't what you receive, but what you do with what you receive. You've shown that tools are not valuable because they're expensive, but because of what they build. Most importantly, you've demonstrated that a single person with the right purpose can create opportunities for hundreds of others to build better lives." The letter continued. "The toolbox I gave you was never empty. It was full of potential. Potential that could only be realized by someone who understood that true wealth is measured in positive impact on others' lives. You've exceeded even my highest hopes for what you might achieve. There is one final tool I left for you, hidden in a compartment you haven't found yet. Look for the false bottom of the wooden tray inside the main compartment. This last tool is not for building houses. It's for building a legacy that will continue long after you're gone." Benjamin looked puzzled for a moment, then hurried to his office. He returned with the original toolbox, the one that had started everything. With practiced movements, he removed the main tray, then carefully pried up what we'd all assumed was a solid bottom. Inside was a single piece of paper and an old brass key. The paper was a deed, not to property, but to a foundation his grandfather had secretly established decades ago. The Robert Chen Legacy Foundation, endowed with $20 million and chartered specifically to support community-driven housing development projects worldwide. "He set this up 40 years ago," Benjamin breathed, reading the documents. "Every successful project he completed, he put a percentage of profits into this foundation. He was planning this for my entire life." The brass key, it turned out, opened a safe deposit box containing detailed plans for replicating the Chen development model internationally, complete with cultural adaptations for different societies and economic systems. But perhaps most remarkable was the foundation's structure. Benjamin wasn't appointed as the permanent director. Instead, leadership would rotate among successful projects, ensuring that the foundation would always be guided by people actively, creating communities rather than managing them from afar. As I watched Benjamin process this final inheritance, not money or property or even responsibilities, but an entire framework for ensuring his work would continue and expand, I realized how perfectly Robert Chen had understood his grandson's character. He hadn't just given Benjamin tools to build a few housing projects in Seattle. He'd created a self-sustaining system for community development that could adapt and grow across continents and cultures. That night, as Benjamin, Maria, and I sat in the community center surrounded by evidence of what was possible when people were given genuine opportunities to build their own futures, a little girl approached us. She was maybe 8 years old, wearing paint-stained clothes and carrying a small wooden box. "Mr. Benjamin," she said shyly, "I made this in the woodworking workshop. My grandpa helped me. He said you might like it." Benjamin knelt down to her level, accepting the box with ceremonial gravity. It was simple, clearly made by a beginner, but beautifully sanded and carefully hinged. "What's inside?" he asked gently. She giggled. "Seeds, for the garden, but also—" She gestured for him to open it. Inside, nestled among packets of vegetable seeds, was a small piece of paper with carefully written words, "For building tomorrow." Benjamin's eyes filled with tears as he hugged the little girl. "This is the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me," he told her. As I watched this exchange, I finally understood the full circle of what Robert Chen had set in motion. It wasn't just about Benjamin inheriting tools and wealth. It was about creating a system where every person, regardless of age or background, could contribute to building something meaningful. That little girl would grow up understanding that her ideas mattered, that her hands could create, that she was part of a community that valued her contributions. She would pass that understanding to her own children, creating a generational legacy of empowerment and possibility. The story that began with cruel words about a worthless inheritance had become something extraordinary, a model for how true wealth is created and shared, how communities can heal themselves when given the right tools, and how one person's vision can multiply into countless opportunities for others. Benjamin still carries his grandfather's hammer to every work site. But now it's accompanied by dozens of other tools, some inherited, some gifted, some made by community members learning new skills. Each tool represents a relationship, a shared project, a moment when someone decided to contribute to something bigger than themselves. The old toolbox sits in that replica workshop, no longer collecting tools but inspiring them. Children visit regularly, running their hands over its worn surface while learning about their community's history. Adults bring their own projects there, following in the footsteps of both Robert Chen and Benjamin, using whatever tools they possess to build something meaningful. And every day, that original red toolbox proves its true value, not as an object to be possessed, but as a symbol of what becomes possible when we stop measuring worth by accumulation and start measuring it by creation. When we stop focusing on what divides us and start building on what connects us. When we understand that the most valuable inheritances are the ones that keep giving long after they're received. Benjamin was right that day in the park. His grandfather hadn't given him wealth. He'd given him the tools to create wealth, not just for himself, but for countless others. And in proving himself worthy of that trust, Benjamin had transformed what might have been a family embarrassment into a story that inspires people around the world to look more carefully at what they've been given and to ask themselves what they might build with it. The mocking words from that law office could have become a source of bitterness and resentment. Instead, they became the foundation for something beautiful, proof that how others define us matters far less than how we define ourselves through our actions. Some inheritances are measured in dollars, others are measured in doors opened, lives changed, and communities created. Benjamin had received both kinds, but it was how he'd used them together that created his real legacy. As I write this, 3 years have passed since that day at the law office. Benjamin's model has been implemented in 12 cities across 4 countries. The foundation his grandfather established has funded over 50 community-driven housing projects. Thousands of families now live in homes they're gradually buying rather than just renting, building wealth for future generations. But perhaps most importantly, the idea has spread beyond housing. The principle of community-owned development has been applied to schools, healthcare clinics, and small business incubators. The toolbox approach, identifying what people already possess and building on those assets rather than focusing on deficits, has revolutionized how social programs are designed and implemented. Benjamin still lives in the same apartment where he grew up, though he could afford to live anywhere. "Why would I leave?" he asks when people question this choice. "This is my community. These are my neighbors. This is where the work is." He's engaged now to Maria Santos, his business partner who shares his vision of development as community building. They're planning a wedding that will be, true to form, a community celebration where everyone contributes something: music, food, decorations, or simply their presence and joy. The old toolbox will be there, of course. Not as a museum piece, but as a working reminder that the most valuable tools are the ones that keep building, keep creating, keep bringing people together to solve problems that seemed unsolvable. And in the end, that's what Robert Chen's true testament revealed. That worth isn't something you inherit or achieve or accumulate. It's something you create, share, and pass on. It's the legacy you build not for yourself, but with others, using whatever tools life has given you to leave the world a little better than you found it. The boy who was once mocked for his worthless inheritance had proven that true value can't be measured by those who don't understand it. But it can be created by those who do. One tool at a time, one community at a time, one person at a time. That's the real testament. Not what you're given, but what you give. Not what you inherit, but what you build. Not what others say you're worth, but what you prove yourself capable of creating when you have the courage to pick up your tools and get to work. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.